5:12 a.m. East 79th Street, Cleveland, Ohio. Two entry teams pressed flat against the clapboard siding of a two-story row house, breath visible in the January cold. A third unit held the alley behind. The Bearcat sat at the mouth of the block, engine idling, headlights dark. Nobody on the street. Nobody watching. Or so the cell believed. The front door came off at 5:12 and 40 seconds. Flash bang through the frame, then agents moving fast through smoke and splinter. The basement stairs were 17 steps down. Everyone counted. 7 minutes later, a sledgehammer met a false wall behind a cast iron boiler. And everything changed. What federal agents found behind that wall had been hidden for 178 days. Not product. Not cash. Not guns, though guns were there too. What they found were 17 women, ages 22 to 28, reported missing from addresses across northeastern Ohio. Each one alive. Each one immediately transferred to waiting Cleveland Metropolitan Health ambulances. The paramedics on scene filed a single collective notation in their run reports: condition consistent with prolonged confinement. 17 women walked out of that row house at dawn on January 16, 2026. The thing that put agents on that doorstep was not a surveillance camera, not a wiretap, and not an informant. It was a water department fitter named Marcus who heard taps in threes at 4 in the morning and did not ignore them. That is where this story begins. 32 hours earlier, December 29, 2025, at approximately 4:12 a.m., a main water line under the intersection of East 79th and Kinsman Road had fractured at a joint, a common failure in that corridor after the first hard freeze of the season. The 4th District Dispatch logged the call and routed it to the Cleveland Division of Water's overnight repair crew, 2 trucks, 4 workers, and a crew lead named Marcus Tillman, 21 years in the division, certified on cast iron and PVC. He was the kind of fitter who reads pipe noise the way other men read weather. The repair took about 90 minutes on the main itself. Standard isolation: cut, sleeve, pack. Cold work, the kind that seeps through gloves and boot leather inside of 20 minutes and doesn't let go. The crew moved methodically under portable work lights strung across the excavation. 2 men in the trench, working the joint sleeve, 1 managing the bypass valve at the curb connection, and Tillman walking the riser line with a flashlight, checking the lateral connections running up into the adjacent foundation walls, making sure the pressure restoration hadn't stressed anything upstream. The alley smelled of wet concrete and iron. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees by the time they pulled the last fitting. The crew was recoiling hose in the alley when Tillman noticed something. The row house adjacent to the main break, a 2-story Kinsman corridor rental, boarded front windows, a Section 8 sticker curling off the front door, the lawn a rectangle of dead crabgrass. That house was logged as vacant. It had been logged vacant since the previous spring by the property management company tied to the landlord LLC of record. No active water account. The service valve at the curb had been shut, but Tillman's hand was resting against the cast iron riser that ran from the city main up through the foundation of that house, and through his gloved palm, he felt something. Tapping. Not the random tick of thermal expansion. Not sediment knock. Rhythmic. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps again. Pause. 3 taps. Tillman pulled his hand back. Put it against the riser again. 3 taps. Pause. 3. He stood there for 40 seconds in a January alley, water on his boots, a city-issued flashlight in his hand, the sound of his crew loading equipment onto the truck behind him. The cast iron was cold enough to burn bare skin. He kept his palm flat against it and counted again. 3. Pause. 3. He looked up at the back face of the row house, second-floor windows dark, plywood panels over the first-floor rear windows, no light anywhere in the structure. Logged vacant. Service valve shut. And yet something behind that foundation wall was counting. Then he pulled out his phone and called a 4th District beat officer he had known for 11 years, a man named Carver, who owed him a favor from a basement flood the previous March. The call lasted 4 minutes. Officer Daniel Carver arrived at the alley at 4:58 a.m. He stood next to Tillman. He put his own hand on the riser. He felt the pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3. Carver told investigators his first thought was that a trapped animal had gotten into the utility chase, a raccoon, maybe a possum. His second thought, which came almost immediately, was that no animal taps in counted groups and then stops. Animals scratch, thrash, scramble. They do not count to 3 and wait. Carver stood at the riser for nearly 2 full minutes, one hand against the iron, the other on his radio. He did not key the radio. He thought about knocking on the rear door of the property. He thought about what knocking on a property he had no authority to access would produce, legally and practically. He took his hand off the riser and stepped back into the alley. Carver did not enter the property. He had no warrant. He drove back to the 4th District and at 5:42 a.m. wrote a brief observation report, attached Tillman's name and contact number, and forwarded it to the Gang Impact Task Force duty supervisor. He noted that the property's LLC landlord had generated a prior flag in the Cuyahoga County Delinquent Registry System. That report sat in a queue until 7:15 a.m., when a task force analyst named Elena Voss pulled it. Voss had been with the joint FBI-CPD Gang Impact Unit for 4 years. She ran the property address against 3 federal databases inside 20 minutes. What she found was not a single red flag. It was a cluster. The LLC that held the title, Green Lawn Property Solutions, had been incorporated in Delaware in April 2024. Its registered agent was a second LLC. That second LLC's registered agent was a third company, domiciled in Nevada, which listed a Cleveland P.O. box as its business address. 3 shell layers. The kind of structure that takes a tax attorney to build and a federal grand jury to unwind. Behind those 3 shells, buried in property transfer records, was a name that appeared twice before in active FBI Cleveland field office files, a man referred to in internal case documents only by the operational pseudonym Delegate. 2 prior indictments, both unsealed, one for racketeering in 2022, one for federal firearms charges in 2023, both cases resolved through plea agreements that produced no prison time and no cooperation. The kind of outcome that sometimes means the defendant gave something up, and sometimes means the opposite. Voss flagged the cluster to Special Agent in Charge Roderick Fain at the FBI Cleveland field office at 8:41 a.m. Her flag was 3 paragraphs long. The third paragraph read, "Given the property's nominal vacancy status, the utility worker's observation of rhythmic tapping, consistent with deliberate human signaling, and the LLC's connection to prior federal targets, recommend immediate thermal assessment and warrant package development." 3 paragraphs. 8:41 a.m. Fain convened a joint briefing with CPD's Gang Impact Task Force at 11 a.m. that same morning. The briefing lasted 40 minutes. By the time it ended, 2 things had been decided. First, the row house would go under passive surveillance immediately. No vehicle contact, no foot traffic near the property, no action that might produce noise on the street and alert anyone inside. Second, an emergency warrant package would go to the duty judge in the Northern District of Ohio Federal Court before close of business. The warrant application rested on 4 pillars: the tapping reported by a city utility worker, consistent with deliberate human signaling, not ambient pipe noise. The property's connection to 3 shell entities linked to a known federal target. The LLC's flag in county delinquency records indicating the property was nominally vacant despite evidence of human presence, and a thermal imaging pass conducted by a CPD unit at 1:17 p.m. that afternoon, which returned heat signatures consistent with multiple occupants in the basement and on the first floor. The thermal read showed at least 14 distinct signatures in the basement area, possibly more. The resolution at that distance, through 2 floors of insulation and plaster, made an exact count unreliable. The duty agent logged it as a minimum of 12 persons in the lower structure and attached a margin of error. 12 persons in a basement the city had on record as unoccupied. The duty judge signed the warrant at 4:49 p.m. on December 29th. Federal rules required at minimum a 12-hour operational window between warrant issuance and tactical execution, unless exigent circumstances applied. The task force requested and received a tactical window opening at 5 a.m. on January 16th, a gap filled by 2 weeks of additional surveillance, pattern mapping, and the parallel development of arrest packages for the cell's known associates. A court case like this shows how many moving parts had to align before a single door came off its hinges. The warrant was the easy part. What followed was 3 weeks of grinding work. Surveillance units ran rotating 8-hour posts from 3 fixed positions within sight of the row house. A city utility van parked along the Kinsman Road shoulder, its side panels stenciled with Division of Water markings and fitted with a pinhole camera array behind the passenger side mirror housing. A parked commercial box truck 200 feet north on East 79th, its cargo bay converted into a 2-agent monitoring station with a portable server rack, 2 monitors, and a chemical toilet. And an upper floor window in a cooperative business 2 blocks north, a tax preparation office whose owner had worked with the FBI field office on 2 prior operations and who quietly relocated her back office staff to an alternate location for the duration. Agents logged vehicle activity from all 3 positions simultaneously, cross-referencing timestamps and plate reads. Which cars stopped in front, for how long, what times of day. They ran every plate. They photographed every face that approached the property. Over 16 days, they identified 7 individuals with documented ties to what federal files called the Kinsman Corridor Cell, a loosely affiliated criminal network that had operated in the East 79th through East 93rd area of the Kinsman neighborhood since at least 2021. The cell used the row house as a stationary inventory point, a location used to stage and monitor human cargo between 3 regional distribution nodes. That's the language the analysts used. The vacant property, the false wall, 17 women, 178 days. That language is the architecture of what it meant. Put yourself in Fane's position for a moment. 3 weeks of surveillance, a signed warrant, a target building in a dense residential corridor, and a thermal image showing at minimum a dozen people in a basement. Every day that passes without entry is another day those signatures on the thermal screen stay in that basement. Every day is also a day a car could pull up, a door could open, and the row house could go empty. Occupants moved to one of the other nodes in the network before agents ever got there. The operational calculus was not comfortable. It never is. There was another problem. The floor plans. 5 days before the planned breach, the CPD tactical coordinator pulled city permit records on the row house to establish the internal layout. The records were from 2007, the last time the building had been legally modified. The current occupants had obviously done significant work since. The boiler wall that concealed the inner room did not appear anywhere on those plans. Neither did a second concealed space that later analysis would locate in the pantry area of the first floor, a hollowed-out utility chase running the full length of the pantry wall. On the morning of January 13th, 3 days before the breach, the tactical team was working off a floor plan that showed them one structure and would deliver them another entirely. The coordinator flagged it. The team ran a second thermal pass and, based on the updated heat signature distribution, revised the breach plan to add a dedicated secondary unit assigned to the first floor interior walls. That revision added 11 minutes to the breach timeline. It also meant agents had a unit specifically tasked to locate a concealed space they had not previously confirmed existed. There is a version of this operation where someone writes off Tillman's tapping as a natural artifact and never files the observation report. There is a version where Voss's database query on the LLC returns clean because the shell structure is one layer deeper than the system can reach. There is even a version where the thermal read gets deprioritized because the signatures are ambiguous. This story is not one of those versions. On January 14th, 2 days before the breach, investigators had their first extended opportunity to review the full missing persons cross-reference that Voss's team had been assembling alongside the surveillance operation. The analyst had been pulling disappearance reports from every law enforcement database in northeastern Ohio, going back 18 months, filtering by demographic profile, by the geographic band running from Lorain West to Canton East, and by the absence of subsequent resolution, cases still open, women still listed as whereabouts unknown. The cross-reference returned 41 names. Of those 41, 17 shared a particular pattern. Each had last been seen in a public or semi-public location. Each disappearance had been logged by a different jurisdiction, with no lateral communication to adjacent departments, and each case had gone cold within 60 days of the initial report, with no investigative leads developed. 41 names, 17 with that specific profile. Voss briefed Fain on the cross-reference the same afternoon. Fain read the briefing twice. Then he called the hospital liaison coordinator at University Hospital's Cleveland Medical Center and requested a confidential preparedness consultation. He told the coordinator to plan for a minimum of 10 patients, possible upper range of 20, presenting with conditions consistent with prolonged involuntary confinement. The coordinator asked no questions. She had worked federal liaison cases before. She began making calls. By the evening of January 14th, the hospital's receiving unit had a protocol in place, a designated intake ward cleared of non-essential personnel, and 3 additional victim services case managers brought in on call. All of it done quietly. None of it logged in any public-facing system. The operation was designated Task Force Action Kinsman. 10 arrest targets, identified by name, with warrants issued. 3 entry teams, 2 ambulance units standing by 1 block south on Kinsman Road, and a command vehicle parked on East 77th. Breaching Team Alpha stacked at the front porch at 5:08 a.m. on January 16th. Team Bravo was at the rear. Team Charlie was in the alley in the Bearcat, assigned to hold the block perimeter and cover any secondary exit. Agents wore tactical gear marked FBI in high-visibility lettering on the back and chest, standard protocol for a joint operation in a residential corridor. Every agent on Alpha and Bravo team had reviewed the revised floor plan the previous evening. Every agent knew the boiler wall, knew its approximate position relative to the basement stairs, and knew that the floor plan in their briefing packets did not match what had been built inside that house. They had rehearsed the basement clearance sequence 3 times in a borrowed warehouse space in Garfield Heights, using orange cones to mark the boiler's position and blue painter's tape on the concrete floor to approximate the wall location. At 5:12 a.m., the breach command went out. The front door frame splintered at 5:12 and 40 seconds. Flash banged through the front room. Agents moved through the entry hallway, cleared the first floor in 40 seconds, living area, kitchen, 2 rooms off the rear, and hit the basement stairs. 17 steps. The basement was low-ceilinged, concrete block, the boiler on the left side against the far wall, overhead pipes, a single work light on a cord. The false wall was flush with the surrounding masonry. No visible seam. The thermal unit had marked its approximate position, and the entry team's sledgehammer found the hollow behind the drywall composite on the second strike. The wall came down at 5:19 a.m. The room behind it measured approximately 9 feet by 14 feet, according to the subsequent structural diagram in the case file. There was a narrow corridor of clearance between a row of pallets stacked against one side and the wall. The pallets had been used as a partition. There was no furniture. There was a single overhead fixture on a portable battery unit that had burned to nothing. The room was dark. The first agent through the opening reported no movement. He called out a verbal identification, "FBI, we're here to help," and held his position at the threshold for a full 3 seconds before advancing. The flashlight swept low first, as the briefing had specified, to avoid startling anyone at eye level. The room was in the condition the case file subsequently described as consistent with prolonged occupancy under extremely limited resources. There was no running water. There was no heat source. The temperature in the room, measured by the paramedics' equipment upon entry, was 41 degrees Fahrenheit. 17 women. Every one of them alive. Every one of them received immediate medical evaluation on scene before transport. The ambulance units had been briefed to expect multiple patients with possible conditions related to prolonged confinement, limited mobility, and possible nutritional deficiency. The paramedics moved efficiently. Each patient was logged by the Cleveland Metropolitan Health Unit on scene and transported to university hospitals. The hospital's receiving team had been notified 90 minutes before the breach. It was, by any measure, controlled and clinical. The paperwork was immaculate. The youngest was 22. The oldest was 28. They had been reported missing from addresses in Lorain, Akron, Canton, and 3 Cleveland neighborhoods, beginning as early as late July 2025. The last of the 17 had been reported missing in mid-October. In each case, the disappearance had been logged by a different jurisdiction: Lorain County Sheriff's Office, Summit County, Stark County, and 3 separate Cleveland precincts, with no single investigative thread connecting them. That is not a procedural failure. It is a deliberate architecture. The cell specifically drew from multiple jurisdictions to prevent any one department from seeing the pattern. One of the women had been reported missing on July 28, 2025, 178 days before agents opened that wall. Her family, a mother and a brother in Lorain, had been notified at 6:14 a.m. on January 16th that she had been found. The notification was made by a Lorain County Victim Services advocate, in person, before 7 a.m. While Team Alpha was bringing down the boiler wall in the basement, Team Charlie on the first floor was working its way along the pantry wall with a density scanner. The utility chase behind the pantry panel was found and accessed at 5:34 a.m. The case file describes its contents in the language federal inventories use: 28 firearms, including 14 pistols of assorted caliber and make, 11 rifles chambered in various configurations, 2 shotguns, and 1 AR pattern rifle with an installed auto-sear conversion device, which constitutes an unregistered machine gun under the National Firearms Act. All 28 weapons were cataloged, photographed in place, and removed to evidence. The auto-sear weapon was flagged separately and referred to the ATF for a parallel investigation. The 28 firearms were staged, not stored. That distinction matters. The ATF examiner who reviewed the scene noted the specific positioning: loaded magazines adjacent, suppressors removed for compactness but present, as consistent with pre-positioning for rapid deployment. According to information developed during post-arrest interviews, the planned movement of that cache was scheduled for the weekend of January 17th through 18th. The breach happened on the 16th. One day, In the 36 hours following the breach, federal investigators processed the row house in its entirety. The evidence team worked in 6-hour rotations, 3 technicians per shift, photographing and cataloging every surface, every void, every piece of material in the structure. The basement room behind the false wall yielded significant forensic material: fingerprints, biological material, fibers, and a collection of handwritten notes on torn paper that the FBI laboratory later determined had been produced inside the room. Some of the notes were written in ink, some in what the laboratory report identified as a carbon-based substance consistent with ash mixed with water. People inside that room had been writing with whatever they could find, pressing words into paper in whatever light came through the gaps around the boiler wall. The notes were cataloged as evidence. Their specific contents have not been made part of the public record. The fingerprint analysis returned matches in the automated fingerprint identification system for 4 of the individuals arrested on January 16th. Those matches connected them not only to the row house interior, but to 2 prior crime scenes in Cuyahoga and Lorain counties, scenes that had been processed without resolution in 2023 and 2024. The fingerprint matches effectively linked the Kinsman corridor cell to activity predating the current indictment by at least 2 years, which strengthened the racketeering count in the federal charge package and significantly complicated the defense posture for those 4 defendants. The cell phone data was equally productive. 7 devices recovered from inside the row house and from individuals arrested on scene were imaged within 48 hours under existing warrants. The communications extracted from those devices, text threads, encrypted application logs, call records, formed the evidentiary backbone of the conspiracy charges against 10 of the 18 individuals ultimately indicted. Among the communications recovered was an exchange between 2 of the arrested individuals referencing the scheduled January 17th movement of the weapons cache, a message confirming the intended destination, and a contact identifier for a third party in a location outside Ohio. That third-party contact became the basis for one of the parallel investigations in an adjacent state referenced in the indictment. Here is something that does not sit easily, even with the benefit of hindsight. The cell had been operational in that corridor for at minimum 3 years. Federal files reference activity as far back as early 2022. The row house on East 79th appears to have been used as a stationary location for at minimum 18 months before the December arrest. That is 18 months of activity in a residential neighborhood, a neighborhood with residents, neighbors, people who walked those sidewalks. And the single mechanism that cracked it was a city worker's hand on a pipe riser at 4 in the morning in the middle of winter. What does that say about the architecture of detection? About how long these structures can operate inside the geography of ordinary life before a single off-script variable breaks the insulation? The answer, based on the case record, is apparently about 18 months. Maybe longer. 10 arrests were made in the first 60 minutes of the operation. 6 individuals were taken inside the row house during the breach, 3 in the first-floor rooms, 2 in the basement, 1 in the alley behind the property who attempted to exit through a rear window and encountered the Bravo team. 4 more were arrested at 2 adjacent addresses on Kinsman, based on simultaneous warrants served by a 4th CPD unit. 2 additional targets were located on Interstate 77 southbound, both in a single vehicle, both stopped by Ohio State Highway Patrol troopers, acting on a federal BOLO issued at 5:45 a.m. That stop happened at approximately 6:30 a.m., roughly 90 minutes after the breach. Both individuals were detained without incident and transferred to federal custody. Total arrests within the first 12 hours, 12. 2 targets named in the original warrant package were not apprehended on the 16th. Both were believed to have left the Cleveland area in the 48 to 72 hours before the breach. The FBI Cleveland field office confirmed active arrest warrants remained outstanding as of the date of this account's most recent available filings. Both are considered to have knowledge of the network structure, its regional nodes, and the identities of additional participants. Their current locations are unknown. In the 2 weeks following the breach, federal agents conducted preliminary interviews with 10 of the 12 individuals in custody. 2 declined to speak without counsel present and were not interviewed. Of the 10 who were interviewed, 6 provided some level of cooperation, ranging from basic biographical information and acknowledgement of their presence at the property to more substantive accounts of the network's operations and personnel. 3 of those 6 were subsequently identified as potential cooperation candidates by the prosecutor's office and entered into proffer discussions. The proffer sessions produced specific intelligence on the network's logistical structure, how the 3 regional nodes communicated, how cargo movements were scheduled and coordinated, which individuals served as intermediaries between the Cleveland operation and contacts in adjacent states. That intelligence was incorporated into the ongoing investigation and shaped the parallel inquiries that federal law enforcement was running simultaneously in 2 neighboring jurisdictions. The details of what was provided in those sessions remain under seal. What is part of the public record is that the proffer discussions produced no plea agreements as of the most recent available docket filings. Negotiations, by all available accounts, remain ongoing. One of the individuals arrested inside the row house during the breach, a man identified in the indictment by his full legal name but referred to here only as a mid-level logistics coordinator for the cell, provided a statement in his initial processing interview that has since been quoted, in redacted form, in the federal case summary. He stated, "We heard the doors upstairs and we knew what it was. We'd been expecting it for a week. Didn't think it would happen when it did, but we knew something was coming." When the interviewing agent asked what had given the cell that impression, the man declined to answer. His attorney subsequently instructed him not to address that specific question in any further session. That statement is in the file. Federal investigators have not publicly disclosed whether they determined what information the cell had received that made them anticipate law enforcement attention in the days before the breach. The 2 fugitives at large remain the most likely source of any such information. Both of those individuals are understood to have had access to operational security details that the other cell members did not. The question worth asking: 12 years of federal anti-racketeering law in this corridor, 2 prior indictment packages tied to the same organizational name, and both times the resolution produced no prison time and no sustained dismantlement. The January 16th operation was demonstrably successful. But what does a cell have to accomplish before the institutional response moves from indictment to actual incarceration? 2 strikes before this one. A row house with a false wall. 17 women. That is how the escalation curve worked. 18 individuals were indicted in the federal case that followed, including the 12 arrested on January 16th and 2 additional co-conspirators identified through phone records and financial tracing conducted in the 2 weeks after the breach. The indictment carried charges including federal racketeering under the RICO statute, conspiracy, federal firearms violations related to the auto-sear modified weapon, and additional charges related to the conditions in which the 17 women were found. The nature of those conditions is reflected in the charge sheet. The charge sheet uses statutory language that does not require elaboration. The operational lead, the individual known in prior case files as Delegate, was among those arrested inside the row house on January 16th. He was found on the first floor during the initial sweep. He was in custody by 5:17 a.m., approximately 5 minutes after the breach began. His attorney entered a not guilty plea at the arraignment. As of the most recent available court docket, no plea agreement has been entered, and trial has been scheduled. The 2 individuals whose locations remain unknown as of this account, do they know where the regional nodes are? Almost certainly. Does federal law enforcement know those locations? Partially. The post-arrest investigation identified 2 of the 3 regional distribution points referenced in the warrant affidavit. The third has not been publicly confirmed as located or disrupted. The network, in the language of the indictment, operated across northeastern Ohio and had logistical connections extending into 2 adjacent states. The specific connections in those adjacent states remain under active investigation. No charges have been filed in those jurisdictions as of the most recent docket filings available. Think about what it would take to notice. Not to investigate, just to notice. You are a water department fitter. It is 4 in the morning in January. You have been working in the cold for 90 minutes. You are coiling hose. A pattern of 3 taps travels up through a cast iron riser under your gloved hand. Your mental model says, air in the line, thermal knock, the building settling. Your mental model says, write it off and go home. Marcus Tillman put his hand back on the pipe. Counted again. Called a man who owed him a favor. And within 40 hours, the FBI Cleveland field office had a warrant, a thermal map, and a tactical plan. That is the whole mechanism. Not a wiretap. Not a confidential source. Not a surveillance camera. A pipe, a pattern, and a man who did not write it off. The 17 women were evaluated at university hospitals on January 16th. Each received follow-up care consistent with the findings of the initial evaluation. Their names are not public record. Their families were notified before sunrise. The hospital's case coordinator filed a single status summary the following morning. All patients medically stable. 178 days. As of the date the warrant package was filed with the Northern District of Ohio Federal Court, the FBI Cleveland field office had identified 17 victims. Caseworkers and victim services personnel from 3 counties remain in contact with them. 2 warrant targets are still at large. The 3rd regional node has not been confirmed. The financial structure, 3 shell entities, Delaware Incorporation, Nevada P.O. Box, property transfers across 2 years, is the subject of a parallel IRS Criminal Investigation Division inquiry. No charges have been filed in that parallel inquiry. The 28 weapons have been cataloged. The Autoseer AR pattern rifle is now in ATF custody as part of a separate federal investigation into the modification's origin and supply chain. The false wall in the basement of the row house on East 79th Street has been removed. The building has been ordered vacated and secured by the City of Cleveland, pending the outcome of the federal forfeiture proceedings against Greenlawn Property Solutions and its parent entities. There is a line in the preliminary investigative summary filed by the FBI Cleveland field office after the operation that reads almost like a procedural footnote. It notes that the discovery mechanism, a utility worker's report of rhythmic tapping in a structure logged as vacant, was not anticipated in the pre-operational intelligence picture and represents an accidental detection event. Accidental detection event. 178 days inside a false wall. 2 prior indictment packages. 2 targets still at large. A 3rd node still unconfirmed. The cell operated because the layers held. The layers held until a man named Marcus Tillman put his hand on a pipe at 4 in the morning in January. The network has been partially dismantled. The demand that created it has not changed. The 2 men with warrants outstanding know how the remaining structure works. And somewhere, in a location that federal investigators have not yet confirmed, a 3rd node is still on the map. What you have heard tonight is a reconstruction of events tied to a real coordinated federal operation in the Kinsman corridor, dramatized from case filings, tactical records, and the investigative timeline. 17 women are out. 12 individuals face federal charges. 2 are still out there. The tapping stopped at 5:19 a.m. when the wall came down. Some things stopped with it.